Okay, hi. Well, welcome to Physiological Psychology. We're going to start with chapter 1 here. We're going to do a little bit of the kind of the introductory foundational material. We'll start with a little bit of, I guess you could say, a theoretical background as we start to focus on why we are interested in understanding physiological processes within psychology. And then we will move into some of the foundations of modern biological science, including evolutionary theory and the evolution of nervous systems in particular. So that way we'll get up to the modern era and ready to understand from there the fundamentals of more modern neuroscience, which will be the real essence of this course. So let's move on here. So, as I said, we'll start with the philosophical ideas that will set us up for, as I had noted, why do we want to study physiological processes and nervous systems in psychology? And this relates to some fundamental core questions that have been around in psychology for really a long, long time, which is to get at this kind of real fundamental question: what is the mind? And depending on how we might answer that question, either takes us away from looking at brains and bodies or makes us look very closely at brains and bodies to understand the nature of what mind is. So let's have a look at this. You may have heard before of this idea known as the mind-body problem. Right? So the question really boils down to what is the difference between mind and body? Is there a relationship between mind and body? One of the core philosophical perspectives on this comes from the philosopher René Descartes. And Descartes presented us with this view that we now know as dualism, or maybe we might call it also mind-body dualism. The essence of what we'll call the Cartesian view, Cartesian is the way of describing any of Descartes' ideas, is that mind and body are two fundamentally different kinds of things or substances. He has what's known famously as a two-substance theory of the universe, right? There's two kinds of core substances. There are physical things, matter, solid matter, a material world. But then there are also non-physical or non-material things that we might call mind or spirit. And his claim is that the body in brains are, of course, made out of matter. They are physical substances, but minds are spirits. And they're very different from each other. The mind is kind of ghostly in a way. And this creates a challenge because we tend to assume that the mind controls the body. And so if I have a thought, for example, and I want that thought to control my body, like say I want to reach out and pick up an object, that begins as a thought in my mind. And that thought is supposed to somehow control my arm so that it reaches out and grabs the object. And this is considered an example of what's known as mind-body interaction, where an idea that originates in the mind is then transferred into the body, and the body does something. And then when the body does something and it receives sensory information that this was done, then of course that information feeds back from the body into the mind, and we become aware of what has happened. And that kind of mind-body interaction is at the core of what we might call Cartesian psychology. But the twist is, how do we explain it? And this becomes a technical challenge because when we think about how physical bodies move, and when I say body in this case, I don't mean necessarily just like a human body or an animal body, but in the case of physics or mechanics, any rigid three-dimensional object is a body. And it's the physics of Newton, really, that explain the movement of bodies, right? We have laws of motion, like Newton's second law is force equals mass times acceleration, F equals ma, right? This tells us that any body, any object that has a mass, if we want to accelerate it, that is, we want to cause it to move, we need to apply a force to it. And so force is what causes something to move. So we can explain in physical terms how one object can transfer force to another object. and cause it to move. But the question then is, what about ideas in the mind? How does an idea, as this kind of more spiritual, ghostly kind of a thing, transfer a physical force to our physical bodies? And Descartes really did not have a satisfactory solution to this. We could, go into a little deep dive on this, and I don't want to maybe go too far with that. But his core idea was that somehow the mind resides inside a part of the brain that he identified as the pineal gland, and from there, inside of the pineal gland, the mind makes these tiny little movements, which are then amplified and transferred through fluids flowing through the nerves, which are then amplified through hydraulic pressure to inflate the muscles and cause limb movements to occur. And this was problematic for a lot of reasons, of course, because if the mind is somehow allowed to materialize inside the pineal gland, now suddenly the mind is no longer this kind of ghostly spiritual kind of thing, but it's now an actual physical event in the brain, in which case we're no longer talking about mind and body as two different things. We've really materialized the mind and made it the same thing as the body. And so, of course, that's one problem with Descartes here as well. The other thing, of course, is that a lot of his ideas about the pineal gland, as we will learn throughout this course, were fundamentally wrong. He believed, for example, that only human beings had a pineal gland and that other animals do not. And that was essentially an error because it's actually very small and difficult to find. And in a human brain, which is relatively large, he was able to observe this gland. But in other animals, it's much harder to find. And therefore, he concluded that they did not have them. And he was also trying to make a further claim that only humans had rational minds that could make decisions and control their bodies in this kind of rational, logical way that he was trying to argue for, whereas animals did not have a mind, and therefore their behaviors were seen as more automatic and reflexive in nature. And so that attempt to draw this barrier between human behavior and animal behavior as if they were very fundamentally different from each other is an important lineage that we also take from Cartesian psychology, not just mind-body interaction and mind-body dualism, but also the kind of fundamental uniqueness of human behavior that makes us really different from the rest of the animal kingdom when it comes to understanding our behaviors and our thoughts and our minds. So we see that interactionism fails, though there might be other flavors of dualism that we could try to support if we want to. I have them listed here on the slide. Parallelism is the idea that mind and body are somehow distinct and different from each other, hence they fall under that heading of dualism. Dualism here meaning two kinds of things, right? There are mental things and physical things. But they work in parallel with each other. That is, they don't actually interact or intersect, rather, right? But they run parallel. So in this view, this is obviously perhaps a strange idea, is that an idea that occurs in the mind happens to perfectly coincide with an event happening in the body, but there's no actual cause and effect between them. So for example, if I wanted to here, scratch my forehead, right? The idea is that at the very same instant that I happen to have the idea that I wanted to scratch my forehead, my arm also scratches my forehead, as you see in the video there. But those two events were totally independent of each other. They just happened to work perfectly in synchrony with each other. And there are various ways that we might try to explain how this might happen. Some of them are quasi-religious and so forth, and we don't really need to worry about it. But that's just one idea that's been proposed. And speaking of quasi-religious ideas, the idea of occasionalism is another one that has been proposed to suggest that God literally intervenes to explain the relationship between mind and body, that when I have the idea that I want to move my arm, God intervenes and causes my arm to move. And so see, there's a variety of creative workarounds here to solve this mind-body issue. If the Cartesian interactionism failed, what other ways can we do it? And in a way, they're all essentially failures, right? So we want to move away from this dualism and say that, well, if we cannot explain how mind and body can somehow coexist in this way, maybe what we want to do is we want to, hinting back to what I said about Descartes' idea about materializing the mind somewhere in the brain, if not the pineal gland, maybe somewhere else in the brain, or maybe just the entirety of the brain, right? And so now what we're doing is we're suggesting that mind and body, mental things and physical things, are not really two different things at all. And so we're now going to say there's one kind of reality, and that's monism. And there are different ideas here. One possibility that we're not going to spend too much time with is that we might suggest that physical things aren't real at all, and that everything is just in the mind. Everything is just an idea in the mind. So only thoughts exist, only mind exists. So we can call that mentalism, or we can call it idealism if you want as well. So it's to say that only ideas in the mind exist, right? So again, I have the idea I want to do something, and that's all that is really real. But separate from that is more directly relevant to us, and that's materialism, to suggest now there's another modern term that's synonymous called physicalism. And in both cases, what we're going to say is that only material substances exist, only solid matter exists, physical things exist, and that's what physicalism is saying. And so they're pretty much the same idea. So now we're going to suggest that whatever it is that we think of as mind, thoughts, consciousness, ideas, feelings, intentions, motivations, all of these psychological things are really material events. But what kinds of material events? Well, probably some kind of a thing happening in the brain and nervous system. And of course, now we would need to explain what those events in the brain and nervous system are. So here you can see the consequences of this, right? We're adopting a materialist view in psychology means that we're going to suggest that ultimately everything that happens in the mind, whether it's a human mind or even in an animal mind, is somehow explainable in terms of what's happening in the nervous system somewhere. And that means that ultimately we would need to explain the nervous system, and that's where neuroscience comes in. Neuroscience works at many different levels of analysis. We can talk about molecular neuroscience, what's happening with the chemicals in the nervous system, and at the cellular level with neurons. But we can also talk about larger systems working in the brain and nervous system that help explain complex behaviors. Can also help us perhaps even explain abnormality, as I've noted here, this idea that can we possibly look at mental health and abnormal psychology and equate that to what we sometimes call psychopathology, which means we're adopting a medical/disease model of behavior and suggest that for every disordered behavioral state, there may be some sort of disordered neural state that is underlying this. And that means, of course, that targeting the treatment of any psychopathological condition would mean targeting some underlying brain state. Another, of course, bigger concern, as I said, is that we want to not just understand things at the cellular level, but maybe these larger neural systems that are can be used to explain certain psychological processes. There are two levels to this, and one is just to understand some really basic things, such as maybe how does memory work in the brain, right? And there's some steps that we can take that are that can help us there, right? That we can maybe understand the importance of the temporal lobe in the brain and the hippocampus and things like this to memory formation and memory storage. And so there are some scientific things that we can do to help understand what's happening when memories are encoded in the brain. We can even understand at the cellular level some of the changes within neurons that are explaining what happens during learning and memory, for example, right? These are sometimes referred to as the easy problems, and they're not especially easy because doing neuroscience is fairly difficult after all. But at least we kind of know how to approach it. We can. It's a puzzle, but we can solve it, right? We think we can, and we've certainly made quite a bit of progress over the last, say 100+ years. But then there's this other issue, which is, again, it sort of relates to that mind-body concern that we talked about just previously, which is how do we connect the dots here between a pattern of activity in the brain, some pattern of activation spreading across hundreds, if not thousands or millions of neurons, to create what we call our conscious mind, our awareness of ourselves and of an outside world, that feeling of what it means to exist as a living, thinking, rational human being. That's what we mean by this term, consciousness. And we might ask the question that, okay, we understand that the brain and the nervous system does a particular job when it comes to acquiring information about the world and using that information to move our bodies around, to find shelter and obtain food and do various things that we need to do to survive. And we might imagine that these are all the kinds of things that could happen even in the absence of consciousness. Would we really need consciousness to explain how our bodies could somehow adapt and move around in the world, right? And so, consciousness is merely just the awareness of that these things are happening. The fact that we can be aware that we are human beings doing things seems to be somehow separate from the mere fact that we are human beings doing things. And this is now referred to by philosophers, particularly the philosopher known as David Chalmers, as the so-called hard problem, because whereas those other problems were called easy problems, because at least we kind of understand how to go around exploring and investigating them. We have some methods in neuroscience that are going to be part of this course that we'll learn about. For this problem, we don't even begin to have an idea of how to tackle it. It's much more of a mystery than a puzzle, right? If you understand the core difference there, a puzzle is at least something that, still we don't know the answer to, but we can try to solve it. There might be some steps and procedures we take to solve a puzzle. But when it's a mystery, it's more like, I really don't even know where to begin, kind of a thing, right? So that's where we are with this. One more thing to say finally about materialism is that some of the more modern views in understanding the nature of cognition rest on this term of embodiment. So the term is oftentimes defined as embodied cognition, which suggests that what we think of as the mind is really just something happening in the body. And so again, the body and things in the body, that is our cognition. It's not somehow separate, right? It's not this idea that cognition happens, which then transfers into the body to make things happen, but rather cognition is something happening in the body. And when the body moves, that is reflective directly of cognition. Or another way, finally, to say it is that cognition is constituted of and by the events in the body. That's part of a broader thesis known as 4E cognition. And so we have these 4 different words that all conveniently start with E. And so in addition to embodied, we have the idea of embedded cognition. And the point here is mainly to suggest that, that we have brains and bodies, which are constitutive of cognition, as I said, but bodies also exist in a physical environment. We are embedded in our physical environment. And it's difficult really to separate our bodies from our environment. And this is where we might start previewing a little bit of an evolutionary perspective, because what we need to do is understand that our bodies evolved in a specific physical environment to have certain characteristics in terms of us being mammals and vertebrates and having a central nervous system and so forth, and eyes that work the way that they do, and detecting a certain pattern of energy from the environment, and ears and skin all detecting different parts of the energy within our environment. That has been an environmental impact on the evolution of not just our bodies, but also our nervous systems and our brains and our sensory organs that feed information into our brains. And that then structures the brain itself, but of course, it gives structure to our psychological experience and the nature of our psychological processes. It's all something that has come from the environment. So it's basically what we would boil this down to is saying you cannot have cognition without brains and bodies, and you cannot have brains and bodies without an extended physical environment. And this, again, the idea of the extended, the third E here, is that cognition is not something that exists on its own, apart from the body and apart from the outside world. It spans what we're referring to here as agent-environment interactions, that cognition occurs within and across the interaction between an agent and their environment. So as we move around, walking, reaching to pick things up and seeing things, that interaction between ourselves and the outside world, cognition is defined as it spans those agent environment interactions. So it extends across the gap now. It's no longer just this mysterious spiritual thing happening at some mystical location somewhere in the brain, but it's an embodied process that is embedded in a physical environment and extends across the body. There is no more dividing line between cognition and physical things, right? It extends out into the world. And finally, of course, because it requires movement, that is, it requires behavior in order for bodies move. That's what they do. We also use this term inactive, right? And so that means that cognition has to be enacted. It has to be a behavior. It has to be a movement. It has to be an action in the world. Again, so in the world is the extended and embedded part. So it is these 4 E's that all characterize some different facet of what we're going to think of as cognition as a material, physical event, right? So that's going to set us up for one final philosophical view, and that is empiricism. What I said earlier about the embedded part is that we are embedded in an environment that contains a variety of different energy arrays, such as electromagnetic radiation. Some small, narrow part of electromagnetic radiation we evolved detectors for, and that is what we refer to as vision, right? We detect the idea of the certain range of light that is detectable by our eyes, giving us the so-called visible spectrum, and we can use that to see. And the argument is that this is where knowledge comes from, and this is where cognition begins, is at the level of sensation and perception. And so our eyes extract information from the world, our ears, our skin, our sense of taste and smell. So we have the 5 senses, right? And so we get this other philosophical idea from another relatively old one here from John Locke. Of course, it predates Locke, the concept of the blank slate. We are born without any innate knowledge or ideas. Everything that we know comes through learning and through the senses. So, of course, this places the study of perception and the study of learning at a foundational position within all of psychology. But of course, because we're materializing these processes and we're suggesting that sensation and perception work through sensory organs and the sensory nerves and the different parts of the brain that process that information, and that learning and memory involve things happening and changes happening within the brain, we need to study all of that. So, of course, this leads us to some of the very earliest experimental psychology was all about trying to study sensory organs. How do the eyes work? How do the ears work? So various ideas that have been proposed. I'll just briefly talk about the doctrine of specific nerve energies, this idea that, that the nature of the optic nerve itself is unique to giving us what we call visual sensations, that when we visually experience the world, we could try to analyze our experience. Normally we think we see objects, right? We see a person's face, we see a dog, we see a color. But the idea is that if we analyze those objects down into their fundamental parts, we could think about what are the building blocks of perceptual experience. And that's what we generally call a sensation. And in vision, we usually think of these sensations as being brightness and color, that all visual experiences at the perceptual level can be analyzed or reduced down to their simplest components that we call visual sensations of brightness and color. For hearing, again, we think I hear sounds, I hear music, I hear a human voice, I hear various things like car engines and all these sorts of things at a perceptual level. But if I analyze it down to the sensory component, I hear pitch and loudness, right? And the same goes for all of our senses. We can analyze taste, for example, down into, I taste an apple, but the idea, that's a perceptual experience, but at the sensory level, we break things down into the 5 primary taste sensations of sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and savory, right? And so this idea that the nature of those sensations originates within each sensory nerve. So the fact that we experience the world visually the way that we do, experiencing brightness and color, is a property of the optic nerve. And the fact that we hear pitches and loudnesses the way that we do is a property of the auditory nerve, and so forth. Now, this is a controversial idea, but at least it's part of the beginnings of trying to understand the nature of perceptual experience by appealing to properties of the nervous system. Around the same time, in the early 1800s, we also see the beginnings of another branch of experimental psychology called psychophysics. And in this case, now we're trying to measure mathematical relationships between the intensity of a stimulus and the intensity of our psychological response. So it's one thing to talk about the physical intensity of light, but the question is how bright is that perceived to be? And what's the relationship between physical measurements of light intensity versus psychological reports of brightness, right? And likewise, what's the relationship between the wavelength of the light, which can be measured mathematically using numbers like 500, 600 nanometers, to perceptions of color? And likewise, the frequency of a sound, and how does that map to perceived pitch? The intensity of the sound pressure levels, and how does that map to perceived loudness and so forth? So all of these kinds of mathematical mappings from physical measurements of the stimulus to what we'll call magnitude estimations of the psychological side of it. That's called psychophysics, hence the term, right? The mapping between the psychological and the physical. We also see further than that, as we again stick to the 19th century, the 1800s here, some further investigations into the functioning of, in many cases now, the central nervous system. So, for example, this idea that you may have heard of before, that we might be able to try to assign specific functions to different parts of the brain. It's called localization of function, and it remains kind of a core area in modern neuroscience. But some of these early ideas that come from the likes of Franz Gall, who invented phrenology, were clearly highly pseudoscientific. The idea here is that there might be these specific locations mapped out in the cortex that are assigned to different aspects of your personality and other higher cognitive functions, and that as they are advanced in one person, this could explain why you might have a bump or protrusion somewhere on your skull and a low spot somewhere else. And this mapping of your cranium is what's called a phrenological map that could be used to diagnose your strengths and your weaknesses. And obviously there's no clear scientific basis for this, but it was just a lot of speculation that, and to be fair to Gall, I don't think that he necessarily extended it to the point that it became, as some people who were not quite so honest, I guess you could say, took this idea and ran with it and tried to sell it as a way to, so just like we nowadays like to click links online to take a personality survey, even if it might be something that's totally unscientific. It just shows that historically human beings like to learn about themselves and they want to understand themselves. And we do that nowadays by random surveys online, but 200 years ago, they did it by paying a phrenologist to read their craniums. So, but other studies that were slightly more scientific. So for example, an ablation study, the modern version of this is called lesioning studies. But what would happen is that if a person has brain damage, we might learn something by understanding what sort of cognitive or other behavioral problems they might suffer. And we'd say that, okay, well, we know that the head damage occurred in this part of the brain. And so we might think that whatever behavior is an issue here, then that tells us that that part of the brain might play an important role in that behavior. A famous case study, for example, is the story of Phineas Gage. You may have heard of him as well. He is the one who was working in a railroad and had an explosion go off prematurely, and it resulted in an iron spike passing through his face, damaging and destroying his eye, but also his prefrontal cortex. And there was a noted change in his personality, but also more importantly, a noted change in his capacity for working memory, planning and reasoning, problem solving, higher executive functioning. And so we might learn from that and say that, well, maybe that part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, plays an important role in that aspect of cognition. Of course, we can also do animal studies as well, because in an animal model, we could perhaps go in and intentionally damage a portion of an animal's nervous system and then observe what sort of behavioral deficits result from that damage to that specific location. Clearly, from an ethical perspective, we don't do this kind of research on humans. Even in modern cases, we do a lot less of that on animals. But in the 19th century, researchers felt pretty okay about doing that kind of research on animals. Something that was also lacking in the 19th century, pretty obviously, was brain imaging research. So if someone was showing some sort of a neurological disorder, such as maybe they had a speech problem known as an aphasia, we couldn't do any imaging to see if they had something wrong with their brain, right? They could have something going on in their brain, a stroke or some other thing that might have happened. But what they could do was wait for the person to die at some point, right? And there were a few notable cases where a person who had aphasias, for example, did pass away, and surgeons did the autopsy to discover lesions in specific parts of their brain. So, for example, the famous Broca's area of the brain was discovered after a patient who had a case of what's known as production aphasia. That is, they have great difficulty producing language, was found after death to have a lesion in his left frontal lobe. And so we now call that Broca's area, and even the aphasia is sometimes referred to as Broca's aphasia. Right? So a variety of autopsy studies could also have been done. And so gradually we piece together a number of discoveries like this, and we end up learning more and more things about the brain. And so this is going to kind of get us close to the modern era at this point. And I'm going to stop this right here and make this our first part of the chapter 1 content. And we will come back with a part 2.